Greetings. This is Life After the Impact. My name is Roxane Johnson. My son's name is Jamal Byrd. He was killed by DC Metropolitan Police on October the 1st, 2019. I'm here with my wonderful co-host, LaToya. How you doing, LaToya?
What's up, Roxanne? How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. You guys, once again, unfortunately, we're meeting again, unfortunately, right? But it's fortunate at the same time. My name is LaToya Benton. I am the mother of Xavier Hill. Xavier was killed January the 9th, 2021 by two Virginia state troopers. As you guys know, at Life of the Impact, we like to say we about that action. And last week we had on the podcast, we are talking about knowledge, right? And we're talking about knowledge, and that you can have knowledge, but if you're not actually using your knowledge and actually applying it, then the knowledge is kind of like powerless. So with that being said, we want to always continue on with our education episodes with advocates and allies, and I am honored to not only have one of my professors here, Professor Davis, but also Professor Vitale. Could you guys do a brief introduction of who you are, please?
Sure, I'll start. I'm Alex Vitale. I'm a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College in the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm also the coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project, which does public policy research and advocacy around community-centered public safety strategies, and I'm the author of The End of Policing.
Awesome. Professor Davis?
Hi, I'm Joshua Clark Davis, Associate Professor of History at the University of Baltimore. I'm the author of the recent book, Police Against the Movement, The Sabotage of the Civil Rights Struggle and the Activists Who Fought Back. And I'm happy to be here today.
Yes.
Awesome.
And we're excited to have both of you here. We're gonna gear this, situate this conversation where we're just gonna let the two of you kind of give us the rundown, right? Why is it what the history of policing and what we're dealing with in the justice movement now, how they're tied together because they are tied together, and then how we can make ourselves educate ourselves more so that we understand what the right ways to move in this present, because I think history can inform us too, right?
Mhm.
How we should move as we're seeking justice for our loved ones against police sponsored violence.
And before you answer that question, too, I want to also, you could also touch on the history that's not taught to us. We had a thing of like just we know just the basic names, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and stuff like that, but I want to touch on the things that we don't know. One of the key points well, I haven't read the book yet, but one of the key points we were looking at was about slow violence. And I think I know that's what we are experiencing currently right now, as far as trying to obtain any kind of justice or accountability for any of our loved ones. So take it away, guys.
Well, let me start, and I'm going to also maybe reference some things that Josh has in the book. When I started doing sort of police studies research 30 years ago, there was a kind of dominant way of approaching the history of policing, which was rooted in what we might call a kind of legal formalism that says that, well, the police are an important element of the rule of law, and that the rule of law is here to benefit everyone, and we need an enforcement mechanism for that rule of law. And when the police do their job properly and the law is enforced properly, this provides a framework of justice that benefits everyone in society. And this is a myth. This is more a myth than a reality. And of
Mhm.
course, it's a myth that, as Josh points out in the book, is reproduced constantly in official textbooks, right? That get
Mhm.
taught to people when they take a class about policing. It's all rooted in this mythology that ignores the real functional history of policing. So
Mhm.
in my book, I talk about, the origins of modern policing as being rooted in overcoming resistance to regimes of exploitation. and the dominant regimes of exploitation that were present in the late 1700s, early 1800s that give rise to modern policing are colonialism, slavery, and mass industrialization, and the migration that was tied to that process. And all of these systems were incredibly exploitative, drove people into horrible misery, and turns out people don't like to be enslaved. Turns out people don't like to have to work 8 hours a day in dangerous working conditions for starvation wages. And so they resist.
Right.
They resist formally by trying to form unions, by organizing slave revolts, by organizing anti-colonial resistance movements. And policing emerged, and they also resist informally, refusing to work, stealing on the job, sabotaging the workplace, but also coping with working class pleasures of, getting into fights, having too much to drink on Saturday night, right? And things like that. And also, learning to read when it's against the law and things like that. And so policing emerges to manage those forms of resistance that threaten those regimes of exploitation. And so we have really, no one was teaching that deep history. In more recent times, in the last 100 years, there was this kind of general awareness that police in the South supported segregation and Jim Crow. But I'm going to turn it over to Josh here to say that we have largely ignored a lot of that history, papered over it, and not ever gotten the full story of police complicity in holding back the liberation of African Americans in the United States.
Professor Davis?
Yeah, that's a great set of points to start off with. And I was going to say thanks to Alex for all of his work. And, I'm a historian, and historians look at the past and we move a bit slowly. And in many cases, we owe a big debt to sociologists like Professor Vitale. And, I think what he's saying is really important is that I would say U.S. historians had looked at policing before, but there's a whole new wave of scholarship in the last 15 years. But that sociologists really had a jump on us in looking at policing in a new way before most historians were. And, some people working in critical race theory in the legal field as well, a few other fields, but I think really it's sociology and a small segment of legal scholarship that after 2000, the mid-aughts began to rethink these assumptions about the so-called criminal justice system that Alex just highlighted. And I think, this is kind of where my book fits into this in a sense, in that there's been some really great historical works in the last decade or so about policing, especially about prisons. I think there's been more on prisons than policing. They're interconnected. But I think that what I wanted to do with Police Against the Movement was to look at a topic that we know has a lot to do with policing, the civil rights movement. Some of the most horrific memories of that movement are of police attacking protesters, whether it's with fire hoses or attack dogs or billy clubs in Birmingham or in Selma. Like, those are among the very most memorable images of the civil rights movement. And yet they reveal less about the relationship between police and civil rights activists in the 1960s than we think. And the reason I say that is because overwhelmingly our public memory of police and the civil rights movement is that they subjected activists to terrible physical violence. Civil rights activists basically, were focused on nonviolence, and they accepted it and they had to live through it, suffer through it, in some cases die from it, and that they really weren't able to push back really until later groups like the Black Panthers emerged in the late 60s, and then they were around for a few years, and then the movements that pushed back against policing kind of didn't do a whole lot until Black Lives Matter in the 2010s. That's the way the story has often been told. And so what I was trying to do with my book was, one, ask the question, well, what did the civil rights movement actually do against police violence? There's a whole record of them protesting it that hasn't been very well remembered. And it's not the whole movement, but it is especially radical parts of that movement. And on the other hand, what are the things that police did to the civil rights movement that weren't caught on camera and were not necessarily physical violence? And that's because most of what we think about in terms of law enforcement targeting activists through surveillance and through false indictments and things like that, we usually think of it as the work of the FBI, Intel Pro. And that's not to say it's not. It's just we have not really, as a country, or even most scholars, really discussed in depth the fact that local police were doing many of those things as well. They were often at the same time as the FBI. Before the FBI, they had this whole arsenal of weapons. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I was working on is, how does the civil rights movement's work against police violence look if we actually bring it to the forefront? And second, how does the work police did against the civil rights movement actually need more attention in terms of this slow violence, the legal weaponry, the trickery, the surveillance, the things that we really think were the province of J. Edgar Hoover, but really local law enforcement all over the country were doing as well.
Same thing. I think I was when I was glancing over your book. I think it was Red Squads. Is that correct? That was the term you used, right? And I think, well, I know I would say, we tell people all the time who's watching this podcast, y'all do your own research at the same time. Granted, you have two professors who are on the podcast tonight. Be sure to still go back and do your own research. It's important to know that, like, red squads were not just in certain towns and cities, they were everywhere. And I like to also say, too, you know, when those kind of foundations are set precedents, then it's not like they can just wipe that away and say, boom, we're done with that. That is still some kind of way set in precedents going on now within policing. Professor Davis, keep going.
Can I add one thing before you?
I'm sorry, Roxane, yes.
You know, the thing about, you know, why we don't know this history has to do with the fact that, you know, there's a saying, whoever controls the narrative controls the definition and how it's explained. And also the idea of, you know, America as this idealized, you know, this perfect place, you know, everybody wants to come here to pursue the American dream, which some of us, the more melanated people, may see it as an American nightmare. Because it has been founded on violence. And that violence has been perpetrated by what we're talking about today, this policing that has violently oppressed people in every step of the way. And the reason we don't know, again, is because we're not controlling our own narratives. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, and of course, we're facing this tremendous backlash today that is reminiscent of the attacks of the McCarthy era that Josh talks about in the book, right? Where anyone who threatened the status quo could just be labeled a communist, even if they weren't. Sometimes they were, but even if they weren't. And this would be the justification for the complete suspension of their rights. I mean, the Constitution was ignored, the law was ignored. Routinely in these matters, people's lives were destroyed, and these movements were directly attacked. And we see a version of that happening now. Some of the classes that I teach at Brooklyn College would be illegal in several states now. I would lose my job. Students would be prevented from taking these classes. The universities would be defunded as a result of talking about the history of slavery and colonialism in the United States and the role of police in perpetuating them. So we are literally fighting a battle with the state to tell the truth about American history.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make. I mean, it's not to in any ways diminish the terrible, terrible impact of physical violence. And of course, Ms. Johnson and LaToya, I mean, you know it all too well that the ultimate damage that law enforcement can do to families is to kill family members. That's the ultimate. And I think what is important to keep an eye on as well is that law enforcement can do tremendous damage to citizens through the legal machinery.
Yes.
And through wearing people down. The mere threat of felony indictments, that's very different than going to jail for a night or two. But when you are facing real prison time, that really has the power to turn someone's life upside down. And that was a frequent weapon that police used against civil rights activists. And this is not just in the South, this is in the North and the West. And it's something, as Alex just pointed out, I mean, today we're experiencing it again, these kind of McCarthyite type attacks. And, we're seeing, I think, a lot of the people who were involved in the Gaza encampments or in protesting ICE. Yes, there are people who are being killed, the two individuals in Minneapolis. There are also people whose lives are really being disrupted and waylaid and turned upside down because they've been charged with felonies that in many cases will not result in convictions even because there's not really solid evidence. But law enforcement can really, in a sense, terrorize people by having them face things like felony indictments for a couple of years. And that's a part of the story of the civil rights movement as well. And, Dr. King faced that as well. He obviously was ultimately killed, but during his lifetime, he faced trumped up tax evasion charges from Alabama and being pulled over for speeding tickets and felony charges that ended up really going nowhere, but really made his life hard. And I think that's part of what the FBI excelled at as well, in addition to surveilling people and doing a whole bunch of things to try to scare people, to essentially chill free speech. If you're afraid of being surveilled or tracked or followed, if you think you might suffer consequences at your workplace, or your family might be upset with you, or you might get in trouble at school, or you might end up, having to go to jail, all of those things can combine to convince people to not protest, and especially not to protest the police, who in our society are one of the very few groups of people empowered by law to have the power to use fatal force. And that's something that makes them just absolutely different from virtually any group in our society.
Josh, I would love to have you tell the story of Reverend Shuttlesworth having this early meeting in the wake of the bus boycott, where these ministers come in from out of town to strategize, and the police. You want to briefly tell that little story?
Sure. And can you all hear me okay still?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, just a second. I'm having some issues. All right. So Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, some of your listeners will know, was a Black minister in Birmingham, Alabama. He, from his start of his career as a minister, was involved in the local NAACP, but from a very early period, in the mid-1950s, he was concerned with policing. Birmingham was known as the most segregated city in the United States by certain measures, and among the many things that were segregated were the police force. We're not going to pretend like having a multiracial police force is some silver bullet, like it's solved a bunch of issues. But from the perspective of the 1950s, when you have all white police forces, of course, Black people were demanding to desegregate police forces. And Birmingham actually was, even in the South, most cities by then had at least one or two token Black officers. Birmingham had none. Shuttlesworth was already pushing for this. But what happened over time was this is even before Rosa Parks, famously refused to give up her seat, which was not the start of the civil rights movement, but was the start of when many white people began to hear about the civil rights movement. That was in Montgomery. Shuttlesworth was in Birmingham, also in Alabama, and he kind of followed in Montgomery's footsteps in trying to desegregate buses in Birmingham as well. On Christmas Day, I believe it was 1956, his home was dynamited and his family almost was killed. I mean, miraculously, they all survived. The police showed up to his house almost immediately in a way that was very strange and suspicious to him. And he basically accused one of the officers on the scene of being in cahoots with the Klan, which was a legitimate issue in Birmingham. Officers who were Klan members, they had showed up so quickly that it suggested they had some type of advance notice. But over the next few years, the police in Birmingham continued to target Shuttlesworth in different ways, to target his organization, to target his church. They would send officers into meetings that were held in his church. They would intimidate people. Some of the men in his congregation caught police officers surveilling their church from sound trucks. And this is in the 50s. This is a kind of a different era of technology. And correct me, Alex, if I don't get to the final question you asked, just let me know. But what happened over the years is that Shuttlesworth began to openly challenge the Birmingham police, yes, for police brutality, but also for the fact that they were trying to intimidate local Black residents from protesting for their rights. The fact that they were sending cops into churches, that they were setting up surveillance sound trucks. And, what happened was, among other things, they made arrests and they held people in times like incommunicado. And at one point, Fred Shuttlesworth sued the Birmingham police, sued Bull Connor, the most notorious sheriff or police chief in the country. And there's one thing you asked about, Alex, that I'm forgetting. What was it that you mentioned at the beginning of the question?
Well, I was also thinking about that early meeting where I think MLK sent some people to help him strategize in a private secret meeting, essentially in his home. And all of a sudden the police show up and arrest everyone.
Right. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah. I mean, this was another example where Shuttlesworth and a few allies were strategizing in a private home. And just as Alex said, the Birmingham police showed up out of nowhere and made arrests, including arrests of out-of-town ministers. And this was in the late 50s. I mean, this was before COINTELPRO had been targeting Black activists, really. And it was this surefire sign that in the city, the local police were keeping such close tabs on Black activists that they were willing to go into their homes to just stop the meeting and to arrest them on the spot. And there was just all kinds of things like this happening in Birmingham, even before, what happened that was most infamous was in 1963. Bull Connor and the Birmingham police attacked children protesting segregation with the tack dogs, with the fire hoses, and those pictures went all over the world. I mean, in many senses, those were the George Floyd moment of 1963, and it electrified not only the United States, but, countries in Europe and South America and Asia. Socialist countries were really interested in how hypocritical the United States was. So that physical violence became the symbol of segregation and police repression in Birmingham. But as Alex just brought up, even when the cameras were not there before that, there were all these more sophisticated forms of
that they knew about.
Yeah, the surveillance, the infiltration, the watching, the intimidation, the stuff that is not going to be caught on TV cameras, but the stuff that eats away at people's willingness and resolve to step forward. Because most people do not want to be involved if the police are going to be at a meeting.
Exactly.
And often we think of this sort of stuff as like secretive, But in fact, often it was done very openly
Mm-hmm.
because the
Mm-hmm.
point was to intimidate people.
Mm-hmm.
So they would very flamboyantly like walk into the parking lot of a meeting and take pictures of everyone's license plates. They would very openly just barge into a meeting that was closed to the public and just be like, try and kick us out.
Right.
We're here to see who comes and what they have to say. And so it was a very visible kind of intimidation on top of the stuff that was happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So how do we get to a point where when we know that the police are intimidating us, right? Because we've had, even in my son's case, when my lawyer has it depositions, I don't know why, but somebody sent over what was called an intel report. And every time I post on social media about when we were going to be protesting, they were sending it to the chief of police in Fredericksburg. And they'll be like, oh, she's at it again. Or I would get to like the state's attorney's office and the police would be there. And I'm like, how's y'all, how, and, so we'll start doing stuff. We'll start using like WhatsApp and like stuff like that. Thinking we're using these apps to like, to, I guess, steer them differently or whatever. But how do you get to the format of when people will say, well, I don't want to do certain things because the police are going to be there, or like you just said, it the death of my son, I'm Roxane is the same way of her son too. That's one kind of pain. But when you have to then try to fight a system that you pay taxes into, that is a different level of pain. Especially when you don't know what you're doing. You might have attorneys who will help you out or whatever, but then you have the ones who will say, "Oh no, I'm not touching that case." And I think that is the portion of the soul violence. We know one lady, Miss Johnson, Wanda. I think she had some kind of a stroke or whatnot after her son had got Oscar Grant's mom.
Oscar Grant's mom.
Has like the medical things that happen to her after the fact, whatnot. Those things are not discussed. So why is there a reason why?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the government, it's important to them to intimidate the families of victims. If they're, and so it does this in a few ways. One is it dangles the offer of big settlements if you'll be quiet.
Right.
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 And if you don't take the offer, or if you speak out anyway, then they have lots of tools of intimidation. And they will try to discredit people. They will make things up. They will invent things. They will look for excuses to arrest the person, to illegally release sealed, like juvenile convictions.
Yes.
Things like
Yes.
that. So they will attempt all that stuff. So how do we respond to that? Well, we have to document, and Josh's book talks a lot about the history of trying to document what is going on to bring it to light. And we have to get that information out to a broader public.
Right.
We need legal allies. We need journalistic allies. We need academic allies. And we need to build, community solidarity, support systems.
Yes.
So that when people are being intimidated, many people who took these tremendous risks during the civil rights movement lost their jobs as a result. And so what are we doing to try to support people who find themselves in that situation, and to do so as publicly as we can so that the community sees, hey, we're in this together. We're trying to figure this out. And I think, if we go back to the Montgomery boycott, right, just the tremendous outpouring of community resources, of carpooling, of, job sharing, of all kinds of, financial support to make the boycott work for the whole community was incredibly inspiring and helped propel the movement into the next phase, I think.
And we were just at an event last Saturday, LaToya, and the police tried to intimidate.
Oh my gosh! Yes,
it was unbelievable the way that they kept coming around and
and they
circling.
just stood there, and they just stood there.
Yeah.
And they finally left, but it was a fact that she was just memorializing her son. We wasn't causing any. And then there was another vendor that was maybe 100 feet from where we were standing at. They
Yeah.
didn't go to that person not one
Nothing.
time to say
Nothing.
anything to them. But when I
Yeah.
pulled up to the event, it was like 7 police cars at the event. And I was like, wait a minute, you
That
work
was,
with the police now? And she says, no, Toy, they're trying to kick us out. And I'm like, why? You're on private property.
we had a moon bounce, some food, and some clothing to give away. What harm were we
And
doing to?
resources.
Right,
Yeah.
mutual support, mutual aid to
Mhm.
build community
That's all
solidarity.
it
That's
was.
what we need. Well, I think they understand, right, that community solidarity is a threat to them.
Yeah.
They want people to be at war with each other, to be beefing with each other,
Yeah.
not trust one another, because that means that they can say, well, you need us, you need a lot of guys with guns on every street corner,
Yep.
because otherwise people will go after each other,
Yep.
when in fact they directly play a role in stimulating this community violence. And
Yes.
I'll turn it back to Josh because he documents the use of agents provocateur and other efforts that may have, directly contributed to some of the violence and unrest during the 1960s. And Stuart Schrader's new book, Blue Power, about the history of police unions, suggests that, the Detroit riots were basically orchestrated by the Detroit police in a time when there was pushback against their budget. They had
Wow.
an intentional campaign to go out in the community and do outrageous things, hoping to provoke a community reaction that then would justify a massive
Their buzz.
action.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
You can't be surprised. You ain't surprised.
I'm not. I'm just saying. But again.
there's this idea, this concept of police riots, of police intentionally provoking conflicts so that if they can claim a community is creating disorder, then police can use that as license to declare open warfare on those communities. And that concept, that theory of police riots goes back all the way to the late 1800s, where there's been different incidents. And it really there were communists and socialists and anarchists who really kind of pushed that theory at first. And there's been a lot of evidence that shows that, yes, in a number of instances, police have wanted riots because that allows them to use ultimate powers that even in our pro-police society, they aren't usually able to use. I mean, I think the points that all of you made were really important. It's about this relationship between activists, survivors, attorneys, and journalists is so important. And I think one thing that I really felt more strongly about, learned more over the course of writing this book, was that it's particular lawyers, of course, who, it's not just that they are versed in federal 1983 statutes or in suing police departments, but it's activists and survivors are probably going to be best served by attorneys who also have something of a mindset themselves of being activists, of
Yes.
wanting to be in solidarity, as Alex said.
Yes.
And the same goes for journalists too, who are in it for the long run. I mean, we all know one of the saddest kind of cliches about journalism: if it bleeds, it leads. And that's still very true in our society, where physical violence, including killings, are given a certain prominence in the media in a way that other types of harms that the state does against people are not. And
they call it trauma porn.
Yeah, exactly. And, that catches people in a way, unfortunately, that they aren't as willing to give time to try to understand the slow drip, 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 the way that law enforcement and states attorneys can weaponize information, whether it's doxing people, whether it's just intimidating people, whether it's illegally safeguarding, gatekeeping public records, whether it's concealing the actions of the criminal actions of law enforcement. Like that, I think it's harder for journalists to turn those stories into compelling narratives. It is possible, but it takes a long-term investment in understanding those things. It takes really being tenacious and informed about public records requests. And so, you've got these publications today like The Intercept or Bolts. There's others, the Marshall Project, but they are invested over the course of years in reporting on law enforcement abuses, including technological and informational, all over the country. And they are even more important now than they would have been 10 or 20 years ago, because we've seen this collapse of local reporting and local media, and so when the police kill someone in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in theory, the Washington Post may cover that. But in earlier decades, it would be, the paper in Fredericksburg would cover it. Maybe the paper in Richmond would cover it. Like, we've seen so many local media close. And so that's really important, but also activists who create their own media and who, whether it's through social media or whether it's through publications or whether it's through just building relationships with established reporters, that interplay of activists, attorneys, survivors, and journalists, I think, is really important to find the people who are actually invested in doing that work in a meaningful way.
Yeah, just on the journalism thing, people should take a look at Alec Karakatsanis's book, Copaganda, that really lays out the way in which local media often view themselves essentially as being in partnership with the police. There is no real independence there. And so to expect these journalists, these mainstream mostly corporate-owned journalists, to be on our side in these conversations, they're not. We can push them. We can try to get certain things into circulation, but we also have to build our own forms of communication independently of them.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say they have a set of established talking points whenever they talk about police killings, where they immediately make the victim the villain. Well, he never finished high school. What that has to do with this?
He was arrested as a juvenile, even though
and you didn't know that before you shot him. So you didn't know that. But to the viewing audience that maybe not is smart enough to be able to think past what they're telling you, you think, oh yeah, I see why they killed them.
Right. And you begin to believe that narrative.
You begin to believe the narrative.
And then you start to ask, people say, well, then why did he have, or then why did the police shoot him? And it's like, that's not a thing you should be asking or even rolling with.
Right. Exactly.
So I was going to say real fast too, going back to Copaganda, because I like, I didn't know there was a book either. I'm going to have to look into that too. And I want to say families, especially impacted families who are listening to this podcast, because we are, when Xavier first got killed, that's what I was told to do. I was told to run to whatever news station I could find who may listen to me. And when I had, I never forget to say, her name was Rosalind, I can't think of her last name, was for the Gooflin Gazette. She wrote some nasty stuff about me and my family within the first 2 weeks of my son getting killed. 6 months ago, this year, she had the audacity to inbox me to ask me that I want to give her an updated story. And I'm like, you cannot be serious right now. When I know what your intent is. But again, I'm thinking as his mom, I can go to the local news station. They're going to at least tell my son's story. And that was not, my son was the villain. I didn't know it. I'm thinking like, hey, he's a victim here or whatever. But again, I think just that relationship, like you said, that relationship between activists, impacted families, lawyers, and not necessarily mainstream media, but some form of media who's going to actually get the stories out there.
Trusted media.
Trusted media, yeah.
I mean, even in the civil rights era, it was, of course, the same story. I mean, media of many different kinds would cover the most flagrant forms of police abuse. You know, when the Birmingham police would literally sick attack dogs on children with TV cameras running. Yeah, but most of those networks were not really interested in things like surveillance or legal targeting of activists. The media that were at the time really kind of fell into two buckets. One was Black owned newspapers, and Black owned newspapers were always covering police violence going back to, I mean, at least the 20s, probably earlier, 1890s. And so, you know, every major city and a lot of not major cities had very important Black newspapers, had prominent, and in most communities, that was the premier Black media. The other type of media was, I guess, what we would call left-wing media, and those tended to be sometimes liberals, but even more socialists and communists. And they, going back to the 1920s, had a strong understanding that the state uses violence as a way to tamp down on political dissent. And it uses the courts, and it uses arrests, and it uses intimidation as a way to discourage its critics and its would-be critics. And there were all these different, you know, socialist papers and magazines and communist papers, and they were also really pushing stories of police violence. And so I think, you know, today that is kind of analogous to some of the things like The Intercept. I mean, The Intercept reports from definitely left of the Democratic Party perspective, and they are a national publication, but they are kind of reporting about stuff all over the country, and they have a lot of interest in technology and in you know, phone tapping and data mining and
Surveillance of all
yeah.
kinds. Yeah.
And so I think they kind of are analogous today. On the other hand, there are, you know, Black controlled media outlets that are really invested in this. I think in Memphis, it's MLK 50 is one of those outlets. There's others, but, you know, finding the right media, finding the right attorneys is so important, you know, and that's it.
Yeah.
They often bring these stories into the mainstream. I think the other thing that's important is, like, any activist and probably any survivor, like, you do have attorneys for reasons, but they also are very expensive. And one of the things that's so important is to try to learn about the very complicated world of public records requests. Because, you know, for every hour an attorney might bill you, you might want to spend 3 hours doing requests.
Doing it yourself.
Yeah.
That's right. That's
and maybe
right.
both, all of the above. An attorney does a request, you know, you're doing a request of your own for your son, and you might get different results. And even that is indicative potentially of a cover-up, right? Because an attorney and a survivor are both governed by the same public records law. But, you know, this is just a major problem. It's not like the records necessarily will solve the problem, but it is very clear that police are very invested in keeping the incidents when they shoot and or kill citizens, that they, in many, many locales, are very invested in keeping that cloaked in secrecy. Even when the law suggests that they cannot do that.
They still do it.
Jocelyn Simonson at Brooklyn Law School has a great book on, you know, community-based legal efforts like participatory defense. That is a model that communities could look to empower themselves without having to rely on high-priced attorneys.
Yeah, and to your point, you know, we have police can wear body cams, right? So that we can see the only job where you get to see people doing their job, right?
Exactly.
But when there's a violent act happens, the way that they will withhold those tapes or keep family from viewing those tapes is nothing short of some
Yeah,
bullshit.
it's terrible.
It's nothing short of some bullshit, because I know families who've waited. We've talked to families who've waited years with an S to even see the video of what happened to their loved.
And then by that time, it's already redacted.
Yes, they give
So
them
it's
time to make up a story.
I want to hit back on the point Professor Vitale was making just now too about. Can you just what was the book called again about the defense book? I'm sorry.
So the participatory defense book, Jocelyn Simonson is the author. She's at Brooklyn Law School, and I forget the exact title, but it is about like people's legal movements and how communities can organize to use the legal system themselves to support one another, to do investigations, to build defense. And she looks at specific programs and projects and efforts around the country where people are doing this.
Thank you, Professor. I'm glad you said that, because y'all, I heard what he said, but I wanted to repeat it for the people who was in the back, because again, we talk to families once a week, and people love to say to us, well, my attorney's doing it, or my attorney knows. And
Yeah.
I just feel like that is probably the first key mistake people make, is letting their attorneys handle all the paperwork. If my child was sick in the hospital, I'm not going to let a doctor just dictate to me and tell me what's going on with my child. I'm going to ask them what's going on, what tests you're giving them. I'm going to act, I'm not the doctor, but I'm still the parent. So at the same time, too, it does not take a high price attorney for you to still know the laws that you are entitled to. You pay taxes.
Well, it's like getting a second opinion sometimes too.
Literally.
Yeah, and I guess also the outlet, the Inquest online is a good community of lawyers and legal scholars that I think, someone like Jocelyn Simonson is a part of, where they are interested in, some of them in abolishing police, some of them in major reforms of the police, but they are all very critical of law enforcement and putting out stories about that. I mean, I think thinking about civil rights activists in the 60s, a lot of them were afraid to protest police, obviously because of violence, but also because for many decades, the people who protested police were seen as radicals and seen as affiliated with communists. And that changed only slowly during the 1960s. And it was the more radical activists and groups like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, who began to actually hold pickets outside of police stations, do sit-ins inside police stations, go to the police chief's house. But I think also what they did was they learned some of these informational techniques and tactics. And as Alex referred to earlier, one of the problems they faced was in a number of cities, police departments sent undercover police officers to infiltrate civil rights groups. I think a lot of people know that FBI did that. People are less aware of the fact that police did that and that they did it with civil rights groups. And part of the process, I think, of discovering those infiltrators and expelling them often hinged on civil rights activists learning about different ways to get information about the police. Often, one of the biggest things was when police brought felony charges against activists, a lot of those activists would work with their attorneys to make the most use out of the discovery process. And so, for example, in 1969, the NYPD accused the Black Panthers in New York of trying to dynamite police stations and department stores. A lot of people have written about it. Panther 21, Tupac's mom, Afeni Shakur, was one of the activists who was imprisoned. But what their attorneys did, and their attorneys were very left-wing and committed, was they used the discovery process to wrest out of the NYPD's hands top secret documents about their surveillance operations, never really seen the light of day. And then they used those as the basis for filing a major federal civil suit against the NYPD in 1971, which those activists eventually won in 1985. But that tactic
and still controls the surveillance practices, the handshoe settlement.
Yeah, and the NYPD has gone back to revise it and limit it, and in the wake of 9/11, they made it smaller. But it's like the way in which that discovery process can be used
Right, for
as
something
a
greater.
tool against police abuses, and can even open up new doors, right? If the police are going to file, if federal law enforcement are going to file indictments against people who are using their phones to video ICE agents, then if they have good attorneys, in some cases, they might be able to get some discovery documents that not only reveal details about those particular cases, but might crack the door open to learn more about how ICE is maybe tracking people who protest that in a general sense. Like, what are their practices, their operations, what are their tools? It's rarely going to be a one-off situation where it's just one activist who their case is unlike what ICE is doing to a whole bunch of others.
I think part of what I hear you saying is strategizing. I think, well, part of the culture, this whole synopsis, like I'm going to an empty building on a Saturday to protest, and then on Monday there's no kind of follow up behind it. What I'm hearing you say is that at least when they were going out in the 60s or whatever and doing certain things, they were using those tools then to still keep pushing the needle forward. I feel like now we'll go out and protest, and then it's like, okay, well then, hey, what's next? We got these little 2 hours we're doing, but what we gonna do after this on Monday? And that's the kind of culture or this hamster wheel that people have been kind of stuck on. Roxane, am I wrong to say that?
Oh, you're absolutely right. And versus like reading in Professor Davis's book about Fred Shuttlesworth, the night before he went to do the bus boycott, his house got blown to smithereens. He was dressed and with his hat and his overall his coat on and smiling, going to the bus boycott the very next day. And so we have to have that kind of being resilient in that way. And that just checking a box. I think we've, gotten kind of, to the point where, oh, we're going to like this, or we're going to watch somebody's TikTok or social media or whatever, but getting involved, putting some little skin in the game is what's important.
Yeah. Shuttlesworth should be more famous. I mean, if you ever go to Birmingham, that their airport is named after him. He is, a major figure there, but I think, he really was quite radical, especially for being one of the ministers involved in the movement. Ministers were all over the place, and Dr. King, even he clearly was more radical than we give him credit for, became more radical over time. But Shuttlesworth was always more radical than him. And, famously, after the Birmingham police attacked the children on national television with the dogs and the fire hoses, and basically just Birmingham police totally embarrassed their city all over the world. It basically forced the local business leaders into a willingness to finally negotiate with civil rights leaders. And they were just worried. Like some of the Birmingham business leaders at the time of that protest, I think they were in Japan trying to line up a business deal, and they just had a very clear sense, this makes us look terrible all over the world. This is bad for business. Back home, they were finally willing to negotiate with Dr. King to say, okay, we're going to have a slow, moderate desegregation of the stores downtown and other things in Birmingham. Dr. King was ready to negotiate. Shuttlesworth said famously, no. We need to keep protesting. And he lost that fight, but he was always ready to push further and harder.
Keep pushing, yeah.
And that's a difficult strategic choice. But I think the way we think about the civil rights movement, we're still overwhelmingly focused on Dr. King, even when we expand the view and we bring in very important people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who shows up in my book, Ella Baker, folks from SNCC. There still are more radical voices that very few Americans have heard of. And that's not to say they're at fault for that. It's very hard to come up with a history curriculum in schools that can fit all of this. But police violence and fighting it was a major priority of radical parts of the movement. And we have to bring that into our understanding of the civil rights story to understand that history. If we leave it out, it really continues this myth. Hey, the civil rights movement, they were just stuck with getting their asses beat and being killed in some situations, and they lived with it. And that's not really what happened. They did fight back. They did protest. They did picket. They did investigate. They did push for change on that specific front of police violence in a way that slowly kind of laid the groundwork for groups like the Black Panthers, who were able to put more forcefully a few years later.
So I'm gonna say this too. I think even what they're doing then is the same kind of thing they're doing like right now, because you know how when they're only highlighting Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, we think it's just like these one or two radical people who are fighting for rights. When the news might only highlight one person getting killed by the police in this area, but it's like 10 other cases. It's a way of them controlling the narrative. And I think because we don't do our own research sometimes, people will just stick on, oh, you talking Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, and that's the farthest they'll go when it comes to civil rights and won't know anything else. So again, I think, having those conversations, we said this last week, it starts at your own home, having these conversations at your own dinner tables and learn beyond Malcolm X. We learn beyond Martin Luther King. You have to start, right at your home.
And part of our strategy must be telling our own stories, not allow other people to control the narrative.
Right.
There's a really good online initiative, the Zen Education Project, that I think was founded with money from the historian Howard Zinn, who wrote The People's History of the United States. But they have this online webinar series called Teaching the Black Freedom Struggle. And, year in, year out, they hold these webinars with historians and people from other fields, and trying to connect them with especially K through 12 teachers to try to expand and enrich the way that, in particular, the Black freedom struggle and the story of movements are taught, right? That's very, and especially as Alex was so rightfully pointing out, we have states right now where it's literally becoming dangerous to people's jobs to teach this stuff, that the teaching of the history of the civil rights movement is in some ways defined as, an illegal act of DEI. And so it's really important, especially in those states that have those laws, that people in other states who don't face those laws are in solidarity and in connection and kind of building resources together to try to reshape some of these historical narratives. As Ms. Johnson said, like you can't wait for other people to teach this history.
Right.
But we said we weren't going to hold you because we could talk about this all day long. But, in the few minutes that we have left, what thoughts or can you offer to our viewing audience, our listening audience, about what we need to be doing in 2026 when it comes to advancing justice against policing?
Or the ending of policing, as Professor Vitale was saying, right? How do you take the history of what you learned and move it to the ending of that, and what that actually looks like? How knowing all the information, how do you then say, okay, how do you actually rethink that system?
Yes.
Well, my view is that we have to be careful in thinking that lawsuits and disciplinary hearings and accountability board, civilian review boards are going to fundamentally change the injustice of policing.
Thank you. Right.
I just don't think that's true. I think history shows us that this just isn't true. And certainly hiring a few more Black police officers is not
going to work
out of this mess. I think we should all be very clear about that not being the solution, right? That we were misled by that idea for a long time, which Josh talks about in the book. And instead, we got to start demanding real resources for our communities so that these communities can keep themselves safe.
That's right.
so that young people have the resources they need, families have the resources they need, because the reason white, wealthy, leafy suburbs are safe is not because there's a narcotics unit and an anti-gun unit and a cop on every street corner. It's because people have their basic needs met.
They have resources there.
And we've been told for too long the only resource we can have to meet our needs is more police, more prisons, more courts, and we have to reject that and
That's right.
start demanding the things that we know will really make our communities better places to live in.
Yes. Amen.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point, I think, in terms of thinking about what we want in place of the current system. The idea of defunding the police got like a huge amount of flack in the wake of 2020, and to the point where a lot of people in and around the Democratic Party wanted to blame it for electoral defeats and Trump's resurgence. And, you know, I think the reality is that so much of policing is also wrapped up in money and the jobs. I mean, it's the same thing with ICE right now. Obviously, racism and xenophobia is a tremendous motivator of expanding ICE, but so is also, you know, Trump clearly wants to. They passed this bill that just delivers tremendous amounts of money and jobs to very draconian, oppressive immigration enforcement. It is about money as well. And so I think personally that, you know, whether people like the phrase defund the police or not, that continued focus on shifting money away from policing is important. And to what it is shifted towards, as Alex was referencing, non-carceral, non-carceral initiatives that are not about arrest and imprisonment, that are about nonviolent engagement. I mean, you know, I don't know if you guys have had an episode on the Baltimore Muncie office, the mayor's office of, what is it, neighborhood and safety engagement. I'm not going to suggest that it's perfect at all, and I think there's probably a lot of different critiques of it. But I think one thing that has happened in Baltimore, at least under our current mayor, is that at least the current mayor has been quite open to the idea that there should be fewer arrests and that there should be fewer police responses to nonviolent, quote unquote, incidents, and that there should be a much greater involvement of social workers in responding to interpersonal conflict and to things that people call into 911. Right?
And not just social workers, credible messengers, clinicians from the community, you know, people who have credibility in the community who can go out and be peacemakers.
Yeah,
and that's really important. And yeah, I mean, and that's very tied into this idea that people who have themselves, you know, recovered from being incarcerated, for example, that you know, they deserve to transition back into society. They deserve to have employment, and not only do they deserve that, but in many ways they are uniquely equipped to maybe work with people who might also face, you know, police violence, might face incarceration. And so that there's an engagement, there's a credibility that comes with having lived through being incarcerated, for example. That should not be a disqualifier in our society, but really people need to be open to the idea that people who have recovered from incarceration have a lot to contribute to our society and should not be treated as legal, political, economic pariahs. You know, like if we're talking about rehabilitation, and again, some people would just say, let's abolish prisons. But even short of that, people who get out of prison should be able to be involved in these types of initiatives, as Alex referenced.
And unfortunately, a lot of people who come out of prison, you don't know they're in prison unless you have the felony on your record. But hey, our president's a felon, so They should get an opportunity too. I'm just
You
saying. I
too can
mean,
be the president.
hey, I'm just saying.
Yeah, yeah. On this podcast, we are unapologetically abolitionists when it comes to policing. We
Yes,
understand that police do not keep us safe.
at
Police
all.
were in peace. Police were organized, funded, whatever, created to oppress people and
Yes.
to be violent, to lead with violence. And leading with violence does not help somebody who's having a mental health crisis.
No.
Leading with balance does not help when people are hungry in need of jobs. And
No.
so we are very clear about that here, right?
Yes. Yes.
The other thing I wanted to mention, I think the book that we were referring to by Jocelyn Simonson is Radical Acts of Justice: How Ordinary People Are Dismantling Mass Incarceration. So we're going to put a couple of these resources on
Our page.
our Facebook page because reading is fundamental.
It absolutely is. And you guys know I love to find me an author. That's how I got in contact with Professor Vitale. So we'll also reach out to her as well to maybe she can come on the podcast to kind of drop some gems on the audience as well. And you guys, if you don't take any kind of key points from today, building community. Building community. I did learn a while ago a lot of police respond to a lot of problems that they're just problems people are having in life and stuff. So I think, start looking within your community about how you can build within your community. People will complain all the time. It's summertime. Kids got out of school right now. Y'all know that. If your community does not have a boys and girls center within the community, try to start organizing something for the kids they can go to so that they will not lack those resources. The things we complain about, begin to try to also build those things to pour back into your community.
Right, right. Take some of that money from policing and put it back in the. Well, I mean, I was a kid. We had rec centers, we had
Right.
day camps, we had all this kind of stuff, and it's not for lack of money because if you could pour billions of dollars into mass incarceration, surely you can find a couple thousand.
For the community.
For the
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Whew, that's a whole lot to take in.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
listen, learn, take it a little bit in at a time, but also, make sure that you show up for something. Show
Yeah.
up for a school board meeting, a town hall meeting, something. Show up so that you know what's going on in your own neighborhood. 'Cause a lot of times we don't even realize these things are happening right in our backyard until they've been executed.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you guys, we put Alex's book on our page, and I also put Professor Davis's book on our page as well. We'll do it as well in the upcoming weeks as well. So you guys be sure to also get the book, but also share it among your family as well, because there'll be terms in there that you might not be familiar with that you want to start familiarize yourself with, and also share it amongst your family as well. Speaking of being about that action, Roxana, segue into what we got coming up next week,
We got
please.
coming up, we have Zay Day happening on June the 20th. We commemorate this lovely man's, uh, LaToya's son.
Yes,
His
it'll be his
birthday is the
24th
12th.
birthday. Well, his birthday's on the 12th, actually,
Tomorrow.
but we're going to actually be, well, we'll be in Norfolk on the 19th. He's got that date.
Yes, yes. Oh yeah, yeah. Let me back up. We'll be
Yeah.
in Norfolk area, Portsmouth area for Juneteenth. Urban League is sponsoring an event. We'll be a part of that, and then on the 20th we will have Zay Day. Let me see if I can get back to my screen here
Are you
and
being fancy? You're going to try to show your flyer? Oh,
I'm
goodness.
gonna try. I'm gonna try.
Oh, man. Oh, boy. See,
Let's
you
see.
look at you.
Oh
You
man,
being
I was
fancy.
gonna try. I don't see the. I don't know what I did with the. Yeah, we'll have to put it on our website. But
See?
on the 20th of June, on the 20th of June, we will have Zay Day. We're gonna have we have a little bit of learning because we like to do education. So we'll talk
Yes.
about know your rights, and we'll have
Yeah,
a
we got to know
lawyer
your
day.
rights training.
Yeah, we have the know your rights training, but then we're gonna have some fun. We'll have 3-on-3 basketball, things the kids can do, things for the grown-ups. So show up down in Norfolk, Virginia. All
Yes,
right.
the flyers on our page, you guys. Attorney Damon Robinson will be hosting a brief Know Your Rights training that morning at 11 o'clock. please be sure to register so we can kind of get a brief head count for brunch. And like Roxane said, that afternoon we're going to have a community cookout.
Yeah,
But in the meantime, be sure to keep building into your community as well.
absolutely. Thank you both, Professor Davis and Professor Vitale. Thank you so much for sharing with us this afternoon, taking some time out of your day. We really appreciate you, and we gonna keep fighting the good fight, right? If nothing, we can learn from history is that history is continuum. It doesn't stop.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop, and so we're always gonna be fighting something. Unfortunately,
Unfortunately, yeah, unfortunately, right. And Roxanne,
unfortunately.
before you close us out, y'all, I'm gonna just say this one more time. Be sure to, if you don't want to read the whole book, that's fine. Even just skim through it, that's fine too. But again, start doing your own research. Stop relying on other people to do the homework for you. Social media, y'all know people can go out and generate whatever they want to generate and like screw the ideas out there. But fact check the things are that is a real thing to make sure what you're putting out is actually credible. Because some things you put out to the community that will begin start like a hamster wheel. It'll just keep going and keep
Mhm.
going and keep going. So again, I encourage you to do your own research. And one last thing, y'all know we still are in the primaries right now for voting. So please get out and vote. If you don't
Yeah.
know who is in, I had some Roxanne. Actually, I had a candidate in my neighborhood the other day,
Oh,
and I
okay.
told her because she was in my neighborhood the other day, canvassing. I was going to look her up because again, you have to be out here in these streets knowing who you are serving as a community. But I also told her too, don't be in my neighborhood this month and you get elected. I can't get in contact with you 6 months from now
All
because that
right.
happens all the time, right? We got to hold them accountable. So you guys,
That's
please
right.
got your ballot in the mail. Vote early. See who's on your ballot. What's going on in your community. Don't forget to vote.
That's right. We know that voting is just one tool, but it's a very important tool. It's a very important tool. And when they don't, when we need to hold them accountable, we not be ashamed to what pull up to their spot because guess what? We paying the rent on that spot that they anyway.
Mhm.
We have to understand
Don't
that
you start.
they work for us. They
That's
work for
right.
us. We don't work for them. They work for us.
That's right.
Lastly, but not leastly, please like, subscribe, and
And
share
share.
and donate because restreaming costs. We got so many things that we are planning and wanting to do. We're gonna make them happen. No, by any means necessary,
That's
but we
right.
definitely could use your financial resources to help us. To do this critical work of educating and pushing us forward in the fight for justice against policing. All right.
Right.
Whew. Take care of yourselves, but always remember to do something. Don't sit at home and just talk about what's going on. Get involved. Get involved. This has been Life After the Impact. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Peace.